You're listening to the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
No hate, no hype, no fear.
Unable to clarify the mire of false beginnings. We are what we force ourselves to be, not what we crawl forward from. Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Garcia. This is Secrets Revealed, and I thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. I have as special guest with me author Gary Wayne, and I'm really glad to have the time and opportunity to follow up from our first conversation. It seems like many of you were had very well enjoyed that whole discussion, and so I look forward to continuing in discourse this evening. Gary, are you there, brother?
I am, and thank you for having me back, and so very excited to be back to be with you tonight.
Yeah, well, it's a great honor. I thank you for all the work that you've done, and definitely, I consider it a great privilege to be able to discuss with you in the way that we, did in the first episode. It seems like a lot of people were very deeply touched by all the things that we covered, and we got a lot of really good feedback as far as the relevance and the of the information that we had brought forth in that discussion.
Yeah, I did as well, and it was probably the most feedback I've got from any interview that I've done in terms of the quality of the information and the depth of the discussion from both sides. So it was very, very nice to have that feedback coming back. I mean, I get feedback from other interviews, but I think our discussion on the first show just seemed to strike a lot of chords out there.
Yeah, definitely so. And the way that we started from the very beginning, tied it together with the antediluvian age, the war in heaven, and then came forth from that, is definitely a perspective that not a lot of people are able to really go into grand depth and discussion, whether because they deny the antediluvian age, or they just haven't done the depth of research that you and I have both put forth in looking into these topics. But I think it's our being able to go back and forth with each other in that way that that really allows the Spirit to speak through us in guiding conversation and going into very deep and uncharted and untouched waters at sometimes.
Absolutely, and hopefully raising some curiosity for people to go even beyond where we have gone. But I think you've got plans to go even deeper into that rabbit hole of the antediluvian world tonight, if I get you right as to what you're wanting to talk about. So it's going to be even more interesting for people who think they knew what happened before the flood, but have such a narrow perspective as we sort of break that even more wide open tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I wanted to do with the series of programs that that you've already agreed to come on with me in sharing is to really go through that from the beginning to the end and touch upon every portion of that. And so, definitely we'll pick up this evening. And, even if we have to do more shows at some other point when you have availability, we'll do so. But I definitely don't want to rush going through the story, because you're one of the few that is able to go back to the beginning and then tie it to the end. And a lot of people miss so much in between. And so I want to, give it as much time as necessary to really bring out the details of the story.
Terrific, and and I know the amount of detail that you're going to bring is substantial. Your research has been so extensive on it that I think it's good to be able to spend some extra time and move forward on this whole complete narrative from the beginning to the end, because there's so much that was going on, not only at the beginning and not only what's going to happen in the end time, but what happened in the middle.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. Well, I had sent you the scroll of Thothis from the Colburn Bible, which for people that have not heard of the text or have not read it, it's, in my opinion, it does seem to speak about the Atlantean age and all that had unfolded with what was going on during that time. And it also seems to fit with what is discussed in like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the work of Helena Blavatsky, and others that have looked into this. Interesting that it calls the motherland Kahimu, which um, church word. He when he looked at these ancient tablets and texts from an Indian priest over there somewhere in around that area, that it called the motherland Mu, and so there seems to be a connection in that way. But um, I thought we could start with Atlantis and some of the mythology surrounding that in order to begin the conversation.
Sure, sure. And I think most people are familiar with the term Atlantis. They may not be completely familiar with the two main sort of documents that have promoted the Atlantean mythology or mythos through the millennia, but certainly Plato wrote two stories, one complete and one unfinished, one called Critias and one called Timaeus, if I pronounced those correctly or close enough. And they do give an accounting of Atlantis and being somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and although there's a lot of interpretation on that, I think most people would agree that's probably outside of Spain and the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic Ocean. In a continent that there was this great civilization that rose before the flood and was destroyed by the flood. But this Atlantean civilization rose to a level of technology through their knowledge and their black magic that probably rivals today if we take those accounts accurately. And it begins with the god Poseidon in the Greek version of Atlantis, taking on and different names of a human female in the different accounts. And climbing would be one of the names that are used, but she produces with Poseidon 5 sets of twins or 10 Titan kings that are going to rule over the Atlantean Empire. And the Atlantean Empire has 10 divisions or countries or groups of nations or continents or whatever you want to call it in the antediluvian world, and they are trying to become the helm of world government. And so this society develops great knowledge, a great military base, great education, a significant mystical religion, a significant development of the sciences, and also is wanting to dominate the world. And in the accounts by Plato, they are on their way to essentially taking over all the other civilizations of the world, however many that there are. And certainly from a biblical perspective, you would walk away thinking there's just one. But from a polytheist and other cultures, there are many more civilizations. But they are checked by the antediluvian Greeks, or the people of Athens, and are defeated. And afterwards, there is also this rebellion against the gods by these titans of Atlantis and other nations as well. And they actually overthrow the gods temporarily before Zeus steps in, and he throws these Atlantean titans into a place called Tartarus. And also in some translations, as in Peter, would be known as the Abyss. And so we have wrapped into the Atlantean mix a very, very similar story to what happens to the Nephilim in the Bible. And in the beginning, these rulers are said to be righteous rulers and judicial rulers and development of man, protecting humankind as opposed to wanting to slaughter them. But as seemingly their human traits take over in the Atlantean accounts, they become more and more evil and use more and more black magic and do more and more evils. And I think also as they lose, which is kind of an allegory in these stories, their immortality, that they start to despise the God of the universe. They start to hate his chosen ones to inherit the universe, the humankind, and then they also start to slaughter and sin against the earth and slaughter humankind. And so again, we have that degradation into absolute evil from this very, very high level, and it very much not only supports what the Bible says, but also what the books of Enoch suggest as well.
Yeah. And for me, when you look at all the stories and all the different mythologies from around the world, you get a parallel account. You see the same kind of allusion to the same kind of things unfolding. And so, can you talk about, because one of the reasons why I do like and so interested in your work, Gary, is because you do cover all bases. You try to examine every piece of evidence you can find. And I am similar in doing my research in that I try to approach discovery of the truth in similar manner. So would you mind speaking about some of the other testimonials and accounts from other groups of people which are also tied to this particular story?
Yeah, so I mean, again, in all cultures around the world, they have an antediluvian pre-flood account of civilizations. And so what we take from that is that, and I'll get to some of those particular civilizations, but what we take from that is that there were many more civilizations than just the Sumerians, who most people are familiar with and who most people would equate the people of the Bible or the people of Noah living amongst. It would be the ancient Sumerians and the Blackheads. So certainly Sumeria would be one of those ancient traditions, and in the Sumerian tradition they have the same account of the Anunnaki gods mating with human females and creating the Anunnaki earthly gods. And we have accounts that are identical in Central American accounts, where they seem to connect their civilization back to Atlantis after the flood, but they also have this pre-flood connection back to civilization, whether it's Atlantis or it's Mu, which you had already mentioned, or it could be Lemuria. Or we also have nations like, or city-states like Dwarka or Malayapuram out of the Vedas. And we have so many different civilizations, it's hard to keep track of. And if we look at Enoch, they're talking about 7 sacred mountains around the world. And of course, mountains are another significant piece of the allegory, as what pyramids are equated with mountains and gods and gateways and portals that are around the world. And so there's at least, from what we know for sure, there is Lemuria, which has kind of come up in the last couple hundred years through some of the theosophical accounts. There's Mu, and there's Atlantis, and there's Sumeria. Those are the ones you kind of, and maybe Lemuria is thought of as the sort of motherland or the previous civilization that maybe the survivors started at Atlantis and Mu and some of these other civilizations. But what's important about the major ones, whether it's Sumeria and Mu and Atlantis, is those are the ones for sure that seem to impact the development and the survival of people surviving the flood around the world. So those ones are very, very important to learn in conjunction with the Bible. So we also have another interesting sort of thought, and I don't know where they get their number from, but in the Game of Thrones, that very, very popular TV series is, and it's aptly named the Game of Thrones, and Thrones is part of that sort of angelic hierarchy, like principalities and archons and things like that. So I think there's an allegory there, but they're suggesting 9 with the various kinds of beings that would have lived in the antediluvian epoch. So they're either kind of making it up as they go, or they're just following an allegorical, metaphorical sort of guidelines with the types of peoples and the type of kingships as they were doing their Game of Thrones in the antediluvian world. So somewhere between 4 and 9, let's say, civilizations. But from a most impactful one, I would say, I would also consider Egypt as part of one of those civilizations, but it didn't play that significant role, and parts of Egypt would have been part of the Atlantean Empire. So Egypt was there and was certainly, part of the main resettlements after the flood, but I'm not convinced, and you may know more on this than me, Zen, whether or not Egypt played a significant part in the antediluvian world. I have not found a lot on that, but we're more of a satellite state to Atlantis, as I found.
It seems, well, and I don't know if this is absolutely true, but according to the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he speaks about after the destruction of Atlantis and after the inundation of that particular empire, and once it disappeared, that the dispersion, that Egypt was then one of the places that the survivors of Atlantis, they broke out and went into different directions, and that they were responsible for establishing and helping these different peoples and cultures to advance themselves in the way that we see after the destruction of this island empire. And so it seems to be that the advancements and the culture being heightened in the way that according to the text, that occurred after the destruction of Atlantis. But whether that's true or not, we're just trying to put together all the stories. But this seems to be also what is alluded to even in the book that in that scroll of Thothis, and also in the work of James Churchward on Mu. And I believe Helena Blavatsky also speaks about it in the same kind of way.
Yeah, and Osiris tends to, in the references that you were making, is connected back to almost, well, probably being a god of one of the gods of Atlantis, or one of the demigods of Atlantis, and one of those people that spreads out around the world and is thought to have gone to not only Central America but Egypt, and maybe even as far as India, to reestablish civilization and reteach the 7 sciences and writing, and so that humanity wouldn't have to start right from scratch, and would help them along. And there's a lot of also, and I'll cover this off in my book, I call them the 7 sacred, or the 7 sages that span out. So, and in the Veda recollection, and of course the Vedas in the Indian, the subcontinent of India, they take their origins back to Mu, and that's who their religious beliefs go back to. So just as the Central Americans are linked to seemingly both Mu and to Atlantis from different aspects or different areas of geography on the continent. So the 7 sages are one of these constants that come out of these great civilizations, whether or not they come from one or they come from several, because there's some legends out there about both. But they are seemingly demigods or mortals. They're mortal to a degree. They're not the actual gods. So they're part of what they call the Shebtiu. It would be what they would be called in Egypt, or the Sabeti in Sumeria, or in India. There's another term, I think they were called Nogals, and in Central America, if my memory serves me right, they were called the Nakals. And these were the 7 sages. And in the Indian version of their Noah, I'm trying to think of what his name is, can't quite come up with it off the top of my head. Maybe I'll come up with it later. He actually takes 7 of these rishis or sages on his boat, and what he does is that's their story of the survival of these 7 sages. So again, what we see coming out of all of this is that the civilizations seem to have developed more quickly after the flood, as opposed to going right back to the sort of Stone Age, with the help of these demigods and this education, this technology that was developed in the antediluvian epoch. And it just came to me, the person in the Vedas and the Sanskrits who would be the Indian subcontinent, India's Noah, is Manu, and he's shown in many depictions on a boat with the seven sages or rishis, and they fan out again in a similar way as the other accounts to Egypt and Central America, again to educate people and bring civilization to a struggling remnant of humanity.
Now, a lot of people, especially for those that are KJV purists, or that only study the biblical narrative, many of them only believe in a young earth, or believe that, all of creation has only existed for the last 6,000 years. Can you talk about what, some areas of evidence, some things that you learned that help you to step away from that line of belief and to embrace the postulation that um, that there's eras in time spoken about and alluded to, even in what they call the gap theory, or what people, with the earth becoming without form and void. That, in my opinion, when you do the research on that, something led to the earth becoming an indistinguishable ruin. And so, can you talk a little bit about what areas of research, what pieces of evidence led you to consider otherwise?
Well, I think the first thing is even though I do believe that science works from a religious perspective, that not all of science is false. I think they work towards an agenda. I think they have some falsified doctrines that sort of promote their own theology and their own religion, but I don't think all of it is false. And
I agree.
when we look at the fossil record, whether or not people agree with on how they do the datings on layers, or how they do carbon dating and things like that, it certainly suggests that the Earth is much older than 6,000 years. And the Bible doesn't say the Earth is 6,000 years old. People just take the genealogy back through the Bible back to Adam, which does come out to about 6,000 years. That doesn't mean that the Bible ever says that the Earth is only 6,000 years old.
Right.
So we have, I'm going to circle back around again on that, but I also look at like these underground discoveries or undersea discoveries of these great cities like Dwarka and all of these other ruins that are coming up, and you look at Machu Picchu, and all of the people say these aren't 1,000 years old and these aren't 2,000 years old. And just as in Sumeria, they say that we didn't build these, the gods built these. And so all of a sudden you have to start to think that, well, are all the other cultures' accounts around the world lying about that? And if they are lying about it, how did they build those? Because they didn't have the technology to build those, and that doesn't make sense. And so you get all of these different conundrums, and you start to say, okay, well, what does the Bible really say compared to what these other mythologies, religions, and science are saying? And what we do learn is that I agree with the gap theory that it suggests that the word and the older alternative translation in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 is that the world became void, because it says in some translations now, and it could be translated as the world became void. So there's this huge gap between when the world is created, how it was destroyed, and then how the earth is renewed. And then we get into the Psalms. There is one particular verse that talks about the renewal of the earth when the Spirit is hovering, and there's just one. But that isn't included in other accounts of the description of when the earth or when the universe was created. So I believe there's a connection between the renewal of the earth that the Psalms are talking about, and it helps explain that now the earth became void. And then beyond that, I look at, and who knows how long a day is, but biblically some people might say 1,000 years is a day, when you can support that biblically. I don't care whether it's 1,000 years or it's one day or it's whatever. But what I do know is, in terms of time, what I do know is that the day 6 account of how humans are created does not match up to the Eden account. So again, you have another gap. And so when you start to consider all of these different gaps, two significant gaps, the earth is likely quite a bit older than what we think, and the creation of Adam was actually a new creation of a human that was designed to be raised above angels.
Absolutely agree. We'll be right back, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody. In talking about the earth becoming without form and void, there's a particular passage. It's only one of 3 places where you will find these two verses being put together in a similar way, and one of those is Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23 through 26. And it's interesting that this particular passage, when you read it, it seems to allude to an antediluvian time. And specifically, it says this: I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. And so this particular passage speaks about a time when there was not yet any man, but all the cities of the wilderness were broken down. And one other passage I want to bring up really quick is Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 20, where it says, and when I shall bring thee down with them that descend into the pit, with the people of old time, and shall set thee in the low parts of the earth, in places desolate of old, with them that go down to the pit, that thou be not inhabited, and I shall set glory in the land of the living. Now, once after we cover this, I definitely would like to talk about the differences between the Genesis 1 account of the creation of man and the Genesis 2 account of the creation of Adam, or the forming of Adam, which is a completely different account, in my opinion, as you alluded to. But let me get you to comment on these 2 verses before.
Yeah, and those are good examples out of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. I don't tend to use those verses because they're not quite as explicit, but that Jeremiah one, I mean, if it was just a little bit stronger for my liking, I would use that all the time. But I've looked at that, and I agree with you that I think it's referring to a time when the earth became void. And then when you match that up with Psalms 104:30, where it basically says something to the effect like this: when you send your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. I think you connect those dots together, and you can't help but think about there had to have been something more going on between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because when I go back, even a couple of verses to 102 in the Psalms, it's talking, and any other reference, whether or not, it's in Job or wherever, they're not talking about the spirit hovering on the earth or the renewal of the earth. It's talking about the actual creation. And I think that is just sort of adding to what was going on in Genesis 1 and 2. And somehow we've lost this over time. I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself. I think as you go through the Bible, it tells you more about the nuances of some of these stories. And it's not a contradiction. It's just adding more information. And the other thing is we know that even though the Torah was given to us by Moses, we also know there was many books that where Genesis was based on that have been lost. So we don't know whether or not there were some other information in there that would make a stronger bridge between what we're talking about in Genesis 1 to Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Psalms.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you. And I think that there's so many texts that have been disappeared, and that if we just had that information, that a lot of things could be clarified, like the nuances that we're speaking about even now. But that these sons of Cain, the children of the devil, in my opinion, have been working very diligently and persistently to eradicate such knowledge and to keep it hidden among their secret orders. And this is why we see, even like the Vatican Library and huge private collections of texts that are not allowed to come to the light of public consciousness, and that are just hoarded. And there's so much wisdom and knowledge that is lost because of their efforts in that manner. But please, if you would, Gary, can you elaborate for those that don't understand or don't know about the differences between the uh, creation of humanity in chapter 1 and then the forming of Adam in
Sure.
Genesis chapter 2?
Yeah, I think most people have been taught that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are the same story. And I too held to that because that's what I was told. But there's so many things that were popping up with me, and you kind of sort of brush over it and you kind of ignore it. But as I started to dig deeper and deeper into research, I went back to revisit it. And so if I look at the account of Genesis 1 and day 5 and day 6, I cannot reconcile that with the Eden account of Genesis 2. And it begins on day 5 where it talks in day 5 about the water that teems with life and the sky is filled with the birds, and they're seemingly created from the water, right? And then it says, let the water teem with living creatures as well. But in the Eden account, and this is just sort of setting up the stage that maybe there's something that's a little bit different here, is that the birds seem to be formed from the ground as opposed to the water. Now, I know somebody can say, well, no, that's not quite the same, but that's just sort of the leading point. And then back in day 3 on the Eden account, Adam is created before the vegetation. And it says, and the Lord made the earth and the heavens, and no shrub of the field had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord had not sent rain, and on and on and on. The Lord formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed nostrils into his life, to give him life. And in Genesis 1, the vegetation is created before humankind is. So again, that's another flag. And then when we move into day 6, humankind or man is created in plural, male and female, and in seemingly great numbers, and told to multiply and spread out. Well, in the Eden account, only Adam is created. They're not created male and female, and they're not told to spread out in numbers. They're to tend the Garden of Eden, and only afterwards, when they're outside of Eden, are they to multiply in great numbers. And again, I can't look at that and say that is saying the great thing. One is plural, one is singular, and then later, Eve is created from Adam's rib, as a clone of the male, but slightly different. And that cannot be the same account, because I do not believe that the Bible is written poorly or inaccurately or is in error. And so I think that we're talking about two different accounts in Eden and Genesis 1, and Adam and Eve do not spread out to fill the earth till Genesis 4. So, and there's a lot that happens between Genesis 2 and Genesis 4, as everybody knows by reading the Bible. So, again, seems to be a conflict. And also, Adam and Eve are confined to Eden, whereas these other people are expected to spread out. And the people in day 6, and I'm going to come back to that, but the people in day 6 are seemingly created in plural to be like gatherers and hunters. Like they're to live off the land, to be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish in the seas and the air and everything living in it. And he's going to give every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth and every tree that has fruit and seed in it. They will be for your food. So seemingly they can hunt and they can eat from every tree, but Adam and Eve aren't permitted to eat from every tree. There's one tree in Eden they're not permitted to eat from. But these are nomadic people. These are hunters and gatherers. And I think that when we look at the Eden account, these were agrarians. These were not hunters and gatherers. And what they did is, and again, you have to look at the language very, very closely that in the Eden account, where it talks about, this is the account of the heavens and the earth, and no shrub of the field had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprung up. Well, shrub of the field is more like a orchard as opposed to wild trees. And no plant of the field are like crops. And there was no man to work the ground. That's to farm. These instructions were not given to the people created in day 6. And so God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils. We don't get any of that description, although somebody could say, well, that's an expansion, but we don't get that at all in that kind of detail in day 6, and certainly they weren't agrarians by the description of the people in day 6. And so when we look at all of this, then we have, in the Eden account, we have Adam naming all of the animals. And he brought them before Adam to see what he would name them. And so he gives all the names to the animals and the birds in the air, but they were, created after Adam, not in Genesis 1. They were created before. So the order's wrong here again. And so when we look at all of that, then we look at Cain taking a wife after being banned. We wonder where the wife comes from. And Adam did not have another son until about 130 years later, which is Seth, because Abel had already been killed by Cain. And so people say, well, he obviously took a daughter from Adam's side, but there's a big period of time because no other daughters and sons were born until after Seth. So a long period of time before that happens. And immediately Cain seems to go to Nod, and he's building a city, and a city with high walls. Who's he building a city for?
Right.
I mean, everything reeks of people being there before, let alone applying the 7 sacred sciences and masonry that's going in it. So just, that's sort of a quick run through as to all the different things that are going on in the Eden account that are just not conducive to what's going on in the day 6 account.
I agree. And also the distinction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is that one is spoken of as Elohim. And then in Genesis 2, it speaks of the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim. And then I agree that every passage, every word that is chosen and selected, especially in the original Hebrew, that there is absolute significance to it being applied and put together in the way that the scriptures are given to us. And that especially when we utilize the Strongs to go back and to look at the contextual meaning, both obvious and implied, that the different word definitions embody, that all of that is very significant. And the other thing, you had mentioned this, where it speaks about the every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, that the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. That verse is very important because, again, it's my opinion that it is alluding to this antediluvian age and to conditions being different, than the earth that was destroyed and that became without form and void, and that it is alluding to those distinctions.
Yes, and also the Adamites were vegetarians and weren't permitted to eat meat till after the
Right.
flood, as it says in Genesis 9:3. And clearly, I mean, and I know you can interpret the day six humans as, they could be just eating fruit, or they could be just eating food, or eating fruit and animals, because there's no real distinction on how it describes that. So, but I just look at the description of them being described more as hunters and gatherers, and then look that they were given what they were given to eat, and there's no separation there that separates it, that says that they couldn't eat animals for food. And I match that up again for context that other accounts suggest that the gods civilized these nomadic, uncivilized nomads that were more hunters and gatherers, and in exchange for consistency of food, taught them education and building art so that they could build monuments and things to honor the gods of the ancient world, or as we would call them, the fallen angels. So again, that makes perfect sense to me.
Yes, to me also. And then especially when you look at the Sumerian mythologies and their description of trying to basically enslave the peoples that were here, when they were banished, when they were exiled from the heavens, and that, in their accounts, they talk about they're trying to enslave and to modify, and also engage in direct bestiality with these particular people. And so, go ahead, Gary. You want to say something?
Well, and I was going to say it also sort of helps answer the question of the four different races of humankind in terms of skin color. And so, in the Quran or in the Kishamaya, it speaks of four different colors. And in all sort of other accounts of the antediluvian world, there were the four different races, and somehow they all survived the flood, at least in small numbers. And that's why you have survival accounts of humans in small numbers as well as giants in small numbers surviving the flood around the world. And even the Quran will talk about four different races that were in the antediluvian world that spread across the world. So this is kind of a constant. And again, I don't think what we're talking about when we say these things disrupts what the Bible says. I think what people have just tried to do is just say, and this is just from 2,000 years of forced theology, let's just make 2 an extension of Genesis 1. And it is to a certain extent, but it's telling another story.
Yes, I agree. And these are the things that people that don't have this understanding or this kind of revelation, they're not open to some of the other stuff. When you look at the ancient mysteries, you learn, and as you said, it's not a contradiction, but it is actually affirming some of the deeper and more profound aspects of what Scripture is alluding to, especially with regard to this antediluvian age, these antediluvian peoples, also to the war in heaven, the rebel angels being cast down here, the connections with the rebel angels and the Nakash, the worship of the feathered serpent worldwide. I mean, all of these things fall into place, especially again, when you look at the archaeological record, you see, as you had mentioned, entire megalithic city complexes at the bottoms of the oceans. Dwarka, you have this city that was recently discovered somewhere near and around Cuba of these megalithic pyramidical temple complexes, um, and then like Yanaguni, and so all of that, you can't explain any of those things and this archaeological evidence unless you apply it to the story as we have interpreted it from Scripture.
Yeah, and just as most Christians look at the flood as just a single flood water event, right? Where the wells and the springs of the earth explode up and they cover the earth with water. But yet there's places in the Bible that suggests that was more going on, like the earth being turned over, and there's connections to the Pleiades and the Orion. And then when you get into Enoch, you find out that there was a conflagration of events, volcanoes and meteorites and earthquakes, which makes sense to what's being talked about in other places in the Bible. And I detail that in my book for people that if you look at those as an antediluvian reference, like I think it's Psalm 18 was the one I was thinking of, then all of a sudden it makes a heck of a lot more sense. And if you look at what other mythologies talk about, this was a number of events, and the key to the kickoff of the flood is the 3 or 2, depending on which mythology that you're looking at, 3 stars of the Pleiades hitting the oceans and making them bubble and the earth to split apart, which starts the whole cataclysmic event around the world. And the Pleiades is one of these constants in other cultures that is connected to the flood. So I think when we look at what the Bible says, and then match that up with what other testimonies from, yes, a polytheist perspective, although some will argue Enoch is not polytheist, and that one I'll leave up for another show for debate. But I think there's a common denominator of consistency and truth that sort of lines up well with the Bible. And for people that want to look at some of the things that in terms of the destruction that went on during the flood, I'd have them look at Psalms 18, 7 through 16 and walk away with that one in a manner that would be, I think it would change your opinion that there was probably more going on with the flood than just the waters coming up from the wells.
This is why, in my opinion, I think it's important to study other venues for grasping and getting insight into truth and what occurred in the prior times, or what the Egyptians reference as Zep Tepe. And then you have things like the historical records of Berosus and Mantheo in describing these very long reigns, according to their accounts, that it was these gods that ruled here on the earth prior and previous to human kings and the rulership by humanity. And things like that also, in my mind, affirm the interpretation of scriptures as you and I have been led to in revelation upon it, and that there are others. I'm not saying, of course, that it's only us. There's been many, in fact, even with forget his name, but he wrote the Pember, George H. Pember. He also talks about some of these things, and his work goes back to the 1800s. And so these are not new ideas and new revelations. People have been led to such discernment all throughout history. And I'm sure that in the ancients, many of the ancients understood it in the way that we now have brought it back again to public consciousness, but that a lot of this information has been stolen from us, that the legacy of humanity is that the truth has been hidden, distorted, and that we have been led astray from it, and that we are now having to rediscover it and coming to understanding on the greater, more deeper, profound aspects of the truth that is contained within the gospel.
Yeah, and another reference that I would have people look at, again, because I like to try and get people back to the Bible so that they can read other sources with confidence that they're not straying from our religion, is read Isaiah 23 a little closer. And I think you find a lot of connections there. And I actually leave that quote off in my Atlantis chapter because this is not talking just about the destruction of Tyr, because there's things in there that it describes that has nothing to do with Tyr, and it has everything to do with Atlantis. And, it's this fortress of the sea that they're talking about. And well, you people of the island, and I know the business part of Tyr was off on this sort of land bridge and an island, but this is the city of revelry. It says it's the old city, and that is an antediluvian term. Anytime you hear ancient or old in the Bible, that is referring to before the flood. And then whose feet have taken her to settle in far-off lands. Yes, the Phoenicians traveled to far-off lands, but again, this is, I think, a reference to the seven sages and the spreading of knowledge after the flood that we talked about with Atlantis. And it says, who planned this against Tyr, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants are princes and whose traders are renowned of the earth? Well, who were the princes and the renowned of the earth? That was the Nephilim and the Titans. And he brought humble the pride of these renowned people. And I'll make a case in the book that not only did Berosus look at Babylon as an allegory for Atlantis.
Everybody, for second hour, I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Secrets Revealed, and I have a special guest with me this evening, author Gary Wayne. Gary, I want to give you a chance to go back and revisit your comment because this is the same reason why I brought up Ezekiel 26 and its reference to the people of old time, and because again, it's my opinion that it's alluding to, as you mentioned with Isaiah chapter 23, that it's a description. If it's not directly connected to Atlantis, it seems to fit that account almost, exactly with what is described. And so, if you would.
Yeah, I was mentioning about any time the Bible talks about old, as in this account, or ancient, or days of old, or times of old, or days of old, this is talking about the antediluvian epoch. So whenever you hear that, then, I can cite over and over and over and over how many times that it's used. I could bring that out. But understand it is like on a 99% rule, like it's almost always talking about the antediluvian epoch. And what's important about that is as I was alluding to, is in this allegory, I'm going to bring this back to Berosus in a second, but this Atlantean city that I think is being referred to in Isaiah, which is referred to as Tyr, is also an allegory for the end time. And so Tyr, Nineveh, and Babylon are the terms that are used to describe this future world center that is going to house the universal religion of the end time. And it's important to understand this because those are the three aspects and why they're being used. One is Babylon is the religion of mysticism and the religion that came from the antediluvian epoch. Tyr is the business center and the world trade, so it's going to be the center of the world trade. And Nineveh was a city of blood where they slaughtered and tortured people, and this location is going to be an evil place. So it's going to represent all three. And Berosus believed Babylon was an allegory for Atlantis. And Berosus was commissioned to write the history of the Mesopotamians as a whole, so that history would not be lost, just as Josephus was commissioned by the Romans to record the history of the Jewish people. So Berosus was commissioned by the Greeks, and right after Alexander the Great, once it split into those four empires. And just in a similar way, I believe it was Manetho who was commissioned by Ptolemy to do the same thing for the Egyptians. So it's important to match up this ancient sort of information to what it says in the Bible, because what they're talking about in New Age or Theosophy or Gnostic or polytheist lore or secret societies is they're talking about the new Atlantis of 10 empires of the end time, which is what Revelation and Daniel talks about in these 10 empires, and this city of trade, which is the helm of the world government, which is being reflected in the Atlantean mythology. So all of this comes together with some significant context, because nothing is new under the sun. If we want to learn about what is going to take place in the end time, we have to understand what happened in prehistory. And to do that, we're going to need a little bit of the polytheist accounts to give us more context. And that's exactly what they do, because they're very, very proud of their history and their religion. Now, we disagree with that, but that's fine. We don't have to believe in their religion, but we can take the information that they're testifying to from a polytheist perspective and utilize that to help understand what's going to come in prophecy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I like to look at what they say from their own words, because they seem to put out the truth in the way that they are trying to make it occur. As far as the things that are connected to New World Order, and turning that over to Antichrist individual. All of that seems to have affirmed itself over time, since, in all of the different accounts that they've published, in speaking about these things, even like with the vision of Albert Pike and the establishment, the pretext for 3 global wars, as to establish this one world order. You can glean a lot of truth from the things that they talk about and that they put out into the public arena. But
because that's been their agenda for millennia.
Exactly.
And they're trying to fulfill it.
Exactly. I agree. I had seen comment in the chat room, Gary, talking about there's, some people do not believe that angels can have sex with human women, and that what is spoken of in Genesis chapter 6, there's that Sethite viewpoint that these are two different groups of humans, which in my mind, if it were humans that were having sex with humans, how is it that a race of giants, 6-fingered, 6-toed giants, came about as a result of that copulation? But a lot of people that still believe that because it says in Matthew that angels are not given in marriage, which has nothing to do with them not being able to have sex with human women, but because so many still buy into that line of thought. And the reason I bring this up is because of the as in the days of Noah, because it's my opinion that what also Christ is alluding to with that reference is the hybrid abominations that were being created by these unholy matrimonies, these unholy copulations with the sons of God and the daughters of Cain. So would you comment on that as well?
Yeah, let me touch on that a little bit. And in the days of Noah, I actually stretched to include the times of Babel and slightly beyond, because Noah lived for an extended period after the flood as well. So I think it's very important to understand Sodom and Gomorrah and the Babel accounts as well as before the flood, as in the days of Noah. So when we look at, first of all, I like your point about there's no way that superhumans could be created from normal humans, because that makes no sense, right? So they weren't just Sethites. They were the sons of God. They were the Ben Ha Elohim. And those are clearly defined in Job 1:6-1 and 38:4-7, where angels are the sons of God. So I kind of look at that as kind of settling the story, but let's just add a little bit more into it. So when you go back to how they understood the Torah from a Jewish perspective, they understood the sons of God as angels, and they copulated with human females. Josephus understood it that way. All of the different testimonies around the world with Titans and Anunnaki and on and on and on understood it that way. And so I think there's, just from a Sethite perspective, I think the Job account sort of put that one to rest. In terms of the marriage thing, yes, that comes from Matthew 22:30, if my memory serves me right. But it says that marriage is not permitted in heaven, but it says nothing outside of heaven. But that also doesn't suggest that they couldn't have sex. And certainly Genesis 6, if you accept those as angels, then that sort of trumps the whole argument, because that says they could have sex. Now, it may not have been permitted, and as it turns out, it was a violation against creation to put the immortal spirit into human flesh and marry the the heavenly spirit with the human flesh to create an earthly god or demigod. And in the first generation, with the immortal spirit, they were demigods. And they would live forever, except that the body would not. And that's where the demons come from, because once the body died or they committed suicide, the spirit's not permitted to go to sleep, and it roams, and it's not permitted into heaven. And that's where the demons come from that Jesus spoke to. And that's why they were afraid he was going to send them to the abyss with his other conspirators when Jesus was dealing with Legion. And it's also who, to these same angels that had sex, who Jesus went to during his 3 days in the grave and basically said, you did not account for the resurrection, and your rebellion is over, and you will be held accountable, and humans will be raised above you. Because as we talked in the last show, the angels were trying to subvert humanity's inheritance, which would come in the future world to be raised higher than angels. Thus, they created Nephilim as the second revenge of Lucifer or Satan to enslave humankind. Now, let's look a little bit closer at what the angels can and can't do. So if we look at in places, and again, I know some of this might be a little bit mystical, but if you look at the Zohar or in the Testament of Reuben, you see a changeling quality, and in there they talk about angels being able to take a gender of their choice, male or female. And that would also suggest that they could create a higher level God on earth, as well as the demigods as having sex with humans, which may answer the question to the pantheon and the different levels, where you have the sort of creator gods and the high level gods, then you have the lower level gods, and then you have the demigods, which are the earthborn gods. And also, when we look at changeling qualities, we know that angels have a changeling quality. I mean, look at what Satan does in Eden, right? He is described, as a serpent. Well, okay, he could have a seraphic form, but he's also a cherubim, so that means he can change forms, right? And when we look at angels with wings and the different types of angels, and yet we see angels when they show up to Abraham before Sodom, they're in human form, as they are in many other human forms throughout the Bible, except in Daniel, again, we see a different form of these angels. So angels have, throughout the Bible, this sort of changeling quality. Well, how do we know that? Well, when we look at what goes on in Jude, and it talks about the angels who left heaven and their habitation, that comes from, and this is going to test my memory a little bit, but Ocatarian, and that's the original Greek word. And I believe, if you look that up in Strong's, it's going to talk about it as in they left their dwelling for spirit, or took off their heavenly spiritual clothes. And we see this used twice in the New Testament. And the second time it's used is in 2 Corinthians 5:2, where it's talking about taking off your spiritual clothes or putting on your spiritual clothes when you go to heaven, just as you will put on your physical clothes when you go to the physical realm. So there's this changeling sort of quality that seems to take place, and we see that changeling quality that's testified in different forms in the Bible. And then there's other people that will talk about, well, the sons of God aren't angels because I can talk about the sons of God in the New Testament. Well, you can also talk a little bit about the sons of God or the children of God in the Old Testament. But these are different accounts of what they're talking about. Not different accounts, but a different sort of application. And let me just sort of expand on that just a little bit. And before I do that, let me just I mentioned Jude 1:6. That connects the sexual sins of angels and of Sodom and Gomorrah, suggesting sex was going on with why these angels fell. And also in 2 Peter, it's the angels who sinned in the days of Noah were locked away in the dungeons to be held for judgment. Why? Because of the sexual sins connected in Jude 1:6. And we also look at, 1 Corinthians as well, that, women are told to have a sign of authority on their heads and to cover their hair, and Tertullian had noted that was because angels love women's hair, which means they are attracted to women for whatever reasons. So again, I kind of look at those different aspects of their ability to have sexual intercourse with human beings, whether or not we find that an attractive thought or not. But when we talk about the sons of God in the New Testament, we're talking about an adoption process as joint heirs with Jesus in the future world, because he has, has gone to the cross, he's died, he's been resurrected, and now he's going to adopt us, and the full time the Gentiles are being fulfilled as we speak because of that. This is not a physical sons of God. We will be called sons of God, and it says we will be called sons of God as joint heirs with Jesus, and we'll have a right to be sons of God as joint heirs in Hebrews. And further on in Hebrews, it says God treats us as sons even though we have human fathers. And I think that's what really nails it in, is because the fathers of the Nephilim weren't human.
Right.
And so we clearly have in Hebrews 12:7, God treats us as sons even though we have human fathers. So I get the argument of the sons of God, and in the Old Testament people will say the children of Israel in Hosea or in Isaiah, the sons and daughters of God. Those are prophecies that go into the future time. They are not an historical. They are prophetic verses. So again, I would look at that as not being accurate. So there's a lot of good arguments. I respect the arguments. I just look at that trying to put a square peg into a round hole and force something that it is not saying, and going down significant arguments to prove the case, where all they can point to is Matthew 22:30, where it doesn't actually say they can't have sex. It just says you can't have sex in heaven, right? And what's important about that is that angels are immortal. They don't need to reproduce.
Exactly.
They're going to live forever. Humans were not created mortal, and they have to have wives, or we have to have wives, at least the way we were created, and we have to reproduce because we're going to die, right?
Right.
Now with with Jesus, I mean, we have the hope in the resurrection, but we're not created immortal, and so that's why we're permitted to have wives, but the angels were not.
Right, and I would also add that what it is alluding to in Matthew, where it says, "For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven," that is actually Yeshua is referencing the book of Enoch, chapter 15, verse 2 and on, where it says, "Wherefore have ye forsaken the lofty and holy heaven, which endures forever, and have lain with women, have defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, have taken to yourselves wives, have acted like the sons of the earth, and have begotten an impious offspring. You, being spiritual, holy, and possessing a life which is eternal, have polluted yourselves with women, have begotten in carnal blood, have lusted in the blood of men, and have done as those who are flesh and blood do. These, however, die and perish. Therefore have I given to them wives, that they might cohabitate with them, that sons might be born of them, and that they might be transacted upon earth. But you from the beginning were made spiritual, possessing a life which is eternal and not subject to death forever. Therefore I made not wise for you, because being spiritual, your dwelling is in heaven, which is exactly what you were alluding to, Gary.
Exactly. And then again, for the sons of God, I mean, that is such a great reference coming out of Enoch to, again, even though Enoch's not canonized, there's a lot of good things in Enoch, and I think it just gives us that context. But I just want to nail that adoption thing that I sort of started off with that. And if you look at in Romans 8:12, it says, those who live by the Spirit of sons of God. Great. And then we move over to Philippians 2:14, and it says we are adopted to become blameless as children of God, to shine like the stars or angels, and to be heirs. And again, adoption, not physical copulation, as what it's talking about in Genesis 6. Two different processes, two different meanings, and this is a future thing for us.
Right, absolutely. I'm in agreement. And again, like when you read so much of the other biblical evidence and extra biblical texts, um, like the Book of Enoch, this becomes absolutely clear. And then when you take into account all the mythologies that you find worldwide that speak about, and not to mention the physical evidence, even like with the when they first started, the pioneers first started to move into and to level the farmland here in America, there were so many mounds and giant bones and skeletons that were discovered, which affirmed the veracity of the Bible. And these kind of things are still being discovered worldwide. Six-fingered, six-toed giants with double sets of teeth that had were of very much larger stature than what we see regular humans. And it also aligns with the descriptions of Og of Bashan, Goliath, his four brothers. And I mean, it's all throughout the biblical text as to the wars between humanity and this seed of the serpent, these Nephilim giant bloodlines.
Yeah, if you want to wipe out all of the other references to the giants in the Bible, I guess you could, but that's not my approach to reading the Bible. I try and make sense of these giants that appear not only in the days of the Exodus, but in the days of Abraham in the war of 4 kings against 5, and that
Yes.
essential war is waged against giants.
Yes.
And you can't, for me, I just can't ignore things in the Bible because it just doesn't fit into my set paradigm or how I would like things to be.
Right.
And so when I started my path back to God, I wanted to read the Bible for what it says. And the things that I struggled with, I dug deeper into.
Yes,
So that
exactly.
I could understand what it means, not try and make it say what it doesn't say or to ignore it. And there's some simple doctrines that I like to do is when I do my research and try and understand things. The first thing is consider all of the biblical verses and put them side by side so you can better understand it. But the first rule on anything is always consider what Jesus said on anything.
Yes, exactly.
Before you, and assemble all other verses in the Bible around what Jesus said and look for that to make sense. And so Jesus wasn't just telling us to look at the days of Noah because people were carrying on and they didn't believe the end time was coming. He wanted us to look at what was going on all throughout the days of Noah and all the different aspects so that we would not be deceived in the end time. Otherwise, he wouldn't put such an emphasis on it, right?
Exactly.
Why even say it?
Exactly. And unless you understand the context of what was going on during that time, those times, in fullness, which includes, in my opinion, like even with what the Book of Giants from the Dead Sea Scrolls speaks about as the miscegenation, the corruption of the DNA of animals and plants, and if you connect it to, because even in the book of Baruch, second Baruch, an extra biblical text, it cites 409,000 giants being killed by the flood of Noah's day. And when you understand the context of why the flood had come upon the earth, that it was not just the sins of humanity, but that the DNA had become corrupted, so that only Noah remained pure in his generations, and also why it was that Joshua, like the flood, was sent into the land of Canaan to wipe out this abominable seed line, why it is that they told him to spare no man, woman, or child, and even the creatures, but to totally annihilate everything. It's only by applying these things that we're speaking about to the war between these two bloodlines that all of it can then make sense.
Yeah, otherwise you walk away saying, what was going on? Why were they so violent? Why were they so barbaric? You
Right.
have to get to the whole story. And, to underline what you were saying about the corruption of the antediluvian world and the DNA, it wasn't just the humans that were corrupted, right? And only Noah and his family was pure. I believe that their technology was so great that they had corrupted all of the plants and most of all of
Yes.
the animals, and that's why animals were sent to Noah for the ark, because only the ones that were still pure and representative of their species were sent.
Right.
Because pretty much the whole world was corrupt in every aspect. And we see that again as what's happening in our time, that
Exactly.
whether it's plant genomes or DNA manipulation, we're going to corrupt the world the same way as what happened in the antediluvian epoch.
Right.
And we should look for the giants to be having an oppression in the end time as well, because that's what happened in the days of Noah.
Right, exactly.
And
As
in
in
the
the
days of
days
Noah.
Noah.
And if you want to know what the religion is, go back to the days of Noah, and that is the Babylon religion that Nimrod had re-inspired. That's going to be the end time religion.
Right, right. All right, we'll be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody, for a final segment. Gary, I'd like to give you a chance to give out your website, contact information, anything that you'd like to share with the public audience.
Yeah, my website is www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's genesis6conspiracy.com with the number 6. And on there, I have a generous excerpt of every chapter of my book. Also a place to buy the book if you want to get an autographed copy. Also connections to Amazon and Kindle and Barnes & Noble. So it's available through those online bookstores, and also through Barnes & Noble through the store if you want to order it through them. You can also order it through any Christian bookstore or any secular bookstore. It's distributed by Ingram's and Send the Light Distribution, so it's easily accessible for them. And you can follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63 or on Facebook under Gary Wayne, and I have 2 pages that I also run, Genesis 6 Conspiracy pages. And if anybody wants to contact me, I'll get back to them. So again, if somebody wants a copy of, it's a little over 2 pages of my sort of point-by-point reference between Day 6 people and the Eden account, I will send that to you. Just get a hold of me on one of those social media avenues or through my website. And you can also get a hold of me at garywayne@shaw.ca and also through my email address on my website. So I also wanted to mention, in terms of people being skeptical on the giants, that they were actually superhumans. not only the books of Enoch, but Louis Ginsburg, who was considered one of the authorities on Jewish history and legends, and in any of his books, he writes about them as giants. Josephus, who wrote the record of the Jewish history for the Romans, considered them giants. Everybody in antiquity, according to him, considered the giants as fact and were mostly wiped out at the flood, although some of them survived. You can go into the Testament of Reuben. You can go into the Gnostic Gospels. You can go around the world. There's just so much evidence that is pointing in that one direction. And this idea that they weren't superhuman or heroes, which is the true meaning of heroes in antiquity, is demigod. So when you look at the superheroes that we see of today that inundate our entertainment, this is a reflection of those demigods of the past, and most of their names and their icons and their allegories all go back to Nephilim. This is a recent thing where people don't think that they are superhumans, and it probably started in around the 15 to 1700s, but all ages before that, it wasn't even an argument. But when you start to interpret things allegorically in the Bible and not read the whole context, that's when you start to go aside. And I understand it. It's easier to accept giants as not being real and the impact that they had on the antediluvian world and after the world and the impact that they've had throughout our history and what's going to happen in the end time. But that's not a reason to go into to take up the doctrine of the allegorics. I mean, those are Gnostics who have molded their way into Christianity. Polytheism takes their scripture allegorically, metaphorically, and only they have the keys to what it means. And they try and insert that into what the Bible says. And the people who first started with the Jerusalem church and with the Jewish people before that on the religion, they were literalists, not allegorists. And so you have this wedge between these two belief systems that is totally opposite in terms of how you approach Scripture. And the allegorical interpretation, which is Gnostic, will be what they will do to the Bible in the end time. They will come to us with a completely different meaning and saying, you have read it all wrong. It's part of the end time delusion. So stick with my advice is stick with the literal interpretation and let the Bible say what it says.
Yes, absolutely, because really the delusion is going to get grander and build more upon even the pagan deceptions of old. Like, the new thing will be that the ancient aliens are gods. Just like they tried to affirm even in Nimrod's day, with establishing the worship of the fallen angels, and giving them reverence in just abominable ways with child sacrifice and things of that nature. I mean, what we're going to see unfolding in our day and age as being the last generation, we're going to see a lot of abomination being instituted as normality. And we're already seeing that here, even in America with the institutions of abortion and homosexuality, and now, the whole transgender, transsexual thing. I mean, just we're seeing, as in the days of Noah, as it says in the scriptures. You want to comment on that, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely. These delusions are going to be, it's going to be such a strong delusion, and brainwashing and preparation is that people will accept this easily, and the people that don't, it will be imposed on them. And again, we get this whole MO, whether or not it's at the time of Babel or the time of Hitler or the time of the Titans and the Nephilim of the antediluvian world. This is what happened. They imposed this mystical religion on the whole world, and those who refused to accept it were slaughtered or persecuted. That's why there's two genocides recorded in Revelation. And the Jewish people will face their own, and the lost tribes of Israel will face their own persecution as a separate genocide that's going to take place. So what has happened in the past is going to happen again. And that's why if your faith is strong and you understand the Bible, you can go read things like Zep-Tepi and the Motherland account that
Right.
you had mentioned earlier in the show, and read it for what it is. It's polytheism, but what is in there that we can glean that helps us, right?
Yes,
And there is
absolutely.
interest. And there's such interesting stuff in there, like dwarves,
Right.
and cyclops, and all. And again, I mean, this isn't even related to technically related to the Greek mythology. This is, I think, as you mentioned, it was Egyptian mythology, and this is the first time I read it when you sent it to me, and I thought this is pretty awesome stuff in terms of being able to understand it. And it talks, about that great house of hidden places, and I'm not
Yes.
sure how to pronounce it, but Kahimu, and if you were to take the A out of Kahimu, that would be Kimu, which would be a name that's used for the Aryans that go back to the antediluvian epoch, if my memory serves me right,
Oh,
and the
wow.
same people that. Yeah, if you Google that, I'm sure you can find that pretty fast, and it's also part of that connection that the Nazis take their Aryan ideology back to Thule, which was either Atlantis or a sister civilization of Atlantis, but more of a northern island, I guess. And but that's where the Asgard came from in the Norse mythology. So is that Atlantis, or is that part of those 7 to 9 kingdoms of that antediluvian epoch? But I just was reading this with absolute fascination. About were they the Cyclops or the Furbog that they were talking about,
Right.
and all of these different. It's basically talking about 4 civilizations: east, west, north, and south,
Yes.
which is constant in some of the mythologies, and so. And the thing is about Zep-Tepi is that is the golden age, or the first time, right?
Right. Right.
And it's known by several different names. And when they talk about the New Age, that's the golden age that they're talking about. It's the New Atlantean age, the New Atlantis that Francis Bacon wrote about, where you have this universal mystical religion and a world government that all works in harmony with science. That's because mysticism and the 7 sacred sciences are all behind the sciences. So it's the religion of mysticism that's in behind science, and this all again happened in the past. And so when we look at the antediluvian epoch, when we look at fairies or we look at wizards, and we need to understand that allegory because it's coming again,
Right.
and that technology is coming again.
Right. Yes. And as strange and as weird as all of that sounds, I mean, it sounds completely like fairy tale fantasy. But this is what we see reflected in the ancient accounts, in the old hidden stories and the legends. And even in this day and age, these kind of things are being discovered, with the little people bones, and again with the giant bones, all
Exactly.
across and around the world. And so all of that affirms the the knowledge and the veracity of the scriptures, and that these things are most certainly apparent and evident in the archaeological record.
And another thing I found in here, and I thought it was just absolutely extraordinary, is the talk about the portals. And again, that goes with fairy mythology and other mythology. Portals to bring these gods or fallen angels into our realm. And when I look at Babel again, people, I've said this on a few shows, but everybody understands Babel as the Hebrew translation as the confusion of languages, but they don't understand the language of Nimrod, which was Akkadian after Babel. And in Akkadian, Babel splits into Bab and El. El is God, and Bab is gateway or
Right.
gate or gateway. I've seen it both ways. And so Babel was trying to be a gateway to the gods, to bring those gods back, to probably try and have them recreate another round of immortal Nephilim after the flood.
Right.
And again, when I look at that all being connected in here between the pyramids and the temples, and again at Babel, it's not in our Babel account, but if you get into the Sumerian account of Babel or the Armenian version of Babel, or the Central American of the Chula and the Aztec accounts of an almost identical account of the building of Babel, they have this temple that was built at the foot of the pyramid that was dedicated to the three stars of the Pleiades that created the flood. I mean, it is absolutely amazing when you funnel in all this other information and just ties everything together.
Yeah, it does, which leads me to a recent discovery, which I found to be fascinating. But an individual had discovered that in the Grand Canyon, there's an alignment, um, and also the topography of the Grand Canyon. They utilize Egyptian terms like the Isis temple, the Osiris temple, things like that, to speak about these different mountains in the Grand Canyon. But anyways, this individual discovered that there's an alignment with Orion and also the Pleiades
Yeah.
to this particular complex. And you normally, when you see things like that reflected in the topography, in these images of the earth from above, and there have these alignments, that underneath the earth there is usually some kind of megalithic structure. And so it's interesting to me that as to whether there is some kind of antediluvian civilization and culture there in the Grand Canyon, because there was that story of Kincaid discovering a very old culture there in the Grand Canyon that was connected to uh, the Orient, and statues of Buddha, mummies, and all kind of things like that being announced in one of the newspapers. I believe it was the Arizona Gazette. But then Kincaid disappears, and the story disappears, and it's never spoken of again.
Yeah, and of course Orion, as you were mentioning, has a worldwide connection
Right.
to the flood as well, and just as the pyramids are believed in Freemasonry history, craft legends, and in other histories as to be a monument, and Graham Hancock has this belief as well, that marked a great civilization that was destroyed by the flood. And of course the belt is supposed to have lined up, according to Bovell, to 10,500, which is a BC, which is a significant year in history. But what I was going to say about this Orion is he's also connected to Azazel, who is also the chief angel of the Watchers, who was the scapegoat and known as Azazel in the atonement sacrifice.
Right.
It's either translated as scapegoat or Azazel, and there's a second one that's second goat that's sacrificed, and Azazel. So iconography is a goat, and so in these legends, and in Greek legends in particularly, Orion, if I remember right, was held accountable for bringing about the deluge as being connected, and also being connected to the Pleiades, where I'm going with this. And Orion was imagined as this great hunter put to death after his pursuit of the Pleiades. Why the Pleiades? Because it's that whole legend has to do with the cause of the flood. And Orion is the unknown great hunter, was also known in Greek and Roman legends as the giant born from Poseidon and Gaia. So he could have been also a either a Titan demigod or a lower fallen angels, because there's a few different legends coming out of Greek on that. But again, I mean, when you go to the Bible, I mean, it says really odd things like in Job, can you bind the beautiful
Right.
Pleiades? Can you loose the cords from Orion? It's Job 38. And also, he who made the Pleiades and the Orion, who turns the blackness into dawn and darkens the day into night, and who calls for the water of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. The Lord is his name. He flashes destruction on the stronghold and brings the fortified city to ruin. Amos 5:8-9. Wow, it just sounds just so much like the destruction of Atlantis.
Right.
And then in Job 9:9, he alone stretches out and treads on the waves of the sea. He is the maker of the Bear and the Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the south. Why is it connecting those to the seas?
Yes, exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
because
So
again, there's no accidents in the
there's
word.
no accidents. And then when you're talking about the North American, whether it's the mounds or some of the archaeology that's being discovered there, I mean, they have legends that go back to the White Snake Land settlers from Atlantis after the flood. And they
Right.
also believe that those sites were built by, I may use the wrong term here, but I think it was either the senior ones or the ancient ones or the wise ones. But that all goes back to this group of builder gods before the flood. And again, that is a constant in mythology. And Jericho in the Bible, if we trust the dating is goes back to about 10,000 years and is one of the oldest cities in the world. And again, in Sumerian mythology, all the major cities, whether it was Uruk or Eridu or any of those cities, were built by the gods, and then they inherited them. And just as what the Incas or the Aztecs or the Maya, they all have the same story. I can't believe that is a coincidence.
Yes, no, not at all. Which again affirms the postulation that we've been talking about in the series that we've done, the last two shows, in great detail. Because again, it's only by accepting this as premise that you are then able to tied together the underlying truth of the prophetic word with that of the ancient mysteries and the mythologies that are found worldwide by the indigenous peoples, whether oral traditions or written. These ancient stories that have been passed down for thousands of years, the text of the Vedas and the different Hindu and the different ancient texts from different peoples, whether the Norse Eddas. I mean, all of it ties together in parallel in the way that we're discussing them this evening.
Absolutely. So, again, would very much encourage people to go back and learn more about the other mythologies. And when you get into that, you are going to get into some real rabbit holes. So you really need to be able to rely on the Bible. And fairy mythology is absolutely rich and is absolutely, in my opinion, an extension of the Gnostic religions and the elven bloodline of the Gnostic Cathars and the Albigensians, which were sister religions out of the sort of rebellious area of southwest France that the Templars and the Merovingians and the Essenes and the mystical Jewish people settled, and so many others, that was a sort of stewing pot for this accumulation that's going to come together of conspiracies to bring about the end time. But if you get into fairy mythology, understand that goes back to Egypt as well, because Pharaoh or fairy, Phare, is thought to derive from the fairy sort of mythology. And in the fairy mythology, there was 4 classifications of fairies. I think I mentioned this before, but this is the fallen angels who came from another planet that were rebellious. There's the earthborn fairies, there's the daemons, which are the spirits, and there's the elementals, which are the little people, and there's 3 classifications of little people. And in the fairy version, the proud angel was a leading light who rebelled, and he wanted to form a new kingdom that was separate from God. So I think the fairy allegories or the fairy mythology actually tells the story of why Lucifer rebelled. He knew he couldn't defeat God, but he wanted a different universe to rule over. And from the Gnostics, he didn't want to serve God anymore. He wanted to be worshipped like God, and was trying to maneuver God into providing him another king with his rebellion. So again, we have that same sort of consistency. And again, once people get into the fairy mythology and all the different allegories of the fairy mythology, and probably things we're going to cover more on in future shows, they're going to find out that lines up perfectly with polytheist religions.
Right. Yeah, and the amazing thing about all of this is when you come to open yourself to the possibilities of those things that we're discussing here, the richness, the profound, the deeply profound nature of the truth that is contained in all of these different aspects of history and mythology and the prophetic word, they come to life for you in a way that is just absolutely mind-blowing. And it just leaves you with your mouth agape, just being awestruck by the awesome wonder of how it all ties together in the story that is, the greatest story never told, and that is absolutely affirmed by the foundation of the word.
I like that line, the greatest story never told.
Yeah, and absolutely that's
line.
what it is, yeah. Well, Gary, we've got 2 minutes remaining, brother. If you would give out your website contact information once more, and then just end with final comment.
Yes, so my website is www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6, conspiracy.com, and you can contact me through that website. You can also connect to my social media through the website. I have interviews posted on the website. You can look at all the different chapters. I have a generous excerpt on each chapter on the website, and you can order an autographed copy through my site if you want an autographed copy, and you can also get a hold of my book through Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, Amazon.uk, Amazon around the world, as well as BarnesandNoble.com, and order through the Barnes & Noble stores if you like. And you can also order through your Christian bookstore and secular stores because it's distributed by Send the Light Distribution and Ingram's. It's also available in Kindle format if you want a digital form. And you can follow me on Twitter. That's at Gary Wayne 63, at Gary Wayne 63, and also follow me on Facebook. I have a page, Gary Wayne, and then I have 2 other pages, Genesis 6 Conspiracy. So you can get a hold of me all of those different ways, and you can also email me at garywayne@shaw.ca, and I will find a way to get back to everybody on the questions that you forward to me. And I spent probably 3 hours on one reply to a fellow in New Zealand today.
Wow!
But it was just such fascinating questions that I just had to get in there and answer them. So I absolutely, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about the subject, and I just love to talk about it.
Yeah, Gary, have you ever thought about doing your own radio broadcast?
That's been suggested, but no, I think I've got a message I want to get out. That's kind of what I'm here to do. So.
Okay, we're right on, brother. Well,
point.
Well, you're doing incredible service to the kingdom. God bless you. We'll talk to everybody soon. Good night, all. Be blessed.